Hi class, this is Neil, and this is the second video in this lesson. In this video, what we're going to be looking at is the two examples following sort of the intro to the lesson. In the first example, we're going to identify an equation given a graph, and in the second example, we're going to write an equation based on what the graph looks like. So, in order to identify what equation we're looking at, we'll want to think about what is the amplitude of this equation, what is the frequency of this equation, and we'll also want to think about, is this a sine or cosine wave? Now, to identify whether it's sine or cosine, what I always like to look at is the y-axis. And when I look at the y-axis, I'm going to identify where does that graph start and where does it end. Now, remember, for a sine wave, which you'll see on the left above, we start in the middle and we end in the middle. For a cosine wave, we start at the top or the bottom really, and we end at the top or the bottom. Sine, no matter what way it is, we always start and end in the middle. If I were to sketch the midline of this graph, it passes right along the x-axis, and we notice we start on that midline and we end on the midline. So that tells me pretty confidently that I'm dealing with a sine wave here. Now, let's talk about the amplitude. Well, if we start at the middle and go down to our minimum here, the lowest point in that graph is -2. So the amplitude there is going to be 2 units. Now, finally, if I want to talk about the frequency, well, between 0 and 2 pi, what part of a sine wave do we see? Well, if you look at the sketch above, what you'll notice is we're only really looking at half of a wave, that lower half of the wave. It would probably be better if I said what we're looking at is what happens when A is negative, because we start going below the midline. But I kind of digress there. What we're seeing, like we mentioned before, is just half of a wave. So that means my frequency is 1/2. Now, if you think about our equation, it's y equals our amplitude times the sine of the frequency times x. And what I mentioned before, we're dealing with a situation here where sine is negative. Okay? So that leaves us really with choice 4. When I looked at that graph, if I were to just eliminate the choices, I know that don't have a amplitude of 1/2. So I would immediately eliminate choice 1 and 3. And then I have to really decide, is it cosine or sine? And it's sine because we start and end on the midline. So that eliminates choice 2. Okay, for example 2, we're asked to write an equation that models the function below. All right, so first thing, I'm just going to write down for myself, to write that equation, I need to know what the amplitude is. I need to know what the frequency is. And then I need to decide, is this sine or cosine? I'll put a question next to that. All right, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sketch the midline. And when I do that, and I look, where does that graph start? And when I think start, I always think along the y-axis. So this graph starts at a minimum, and when it completes one cycle, it ends at a minimum. Okay, so looking at that, that means that I'm definitely looking at a cosine wave. Now, the amplitude is the distance from the midline. In this graph, the amplitude is just 1. We just travel 1 unit above and 1 unit below the midline. The frequency is the number of cycles we go through in 2 pi. It might be a little hard to see, but if I look at the maximum point of my graph here, that's pi units. So from 0 to pi, how many cycles do we go through? Well, we go through 1, 2. So I'm just going to make a note of that. 2 cycles in 1 pi unit. So in 2 pi units, we would go through 4 cycles. So our frequency here is 4. Finally, I want to say what are we dealing with here? Are we dealing with a positive a value or a negative a value? Well, looking kind of above at the cosine equation, here we started a minimum, we ended a minimum, so that's 1 cycle. We're definitely dealing with a situation where a is negative. So when I write my equation, I'm going to write y equals negative 1 cosine of 4x. Now you don't really need that negative, you don't need that 1 there, so we could also write that as y equals negative cosine of 4x.